So I want to follow up on two aspects of this. Let's hold with this East Coast West Coast dichotomy for a minute. One is in the West Coast version, the social entrepreneur version, versus the East Coast version, which we haven't yet labeled in quite the same way. How does change get made? Where does social change come from? Is it the two guys in the garage are out there? What's their relationship to social movements versus the old model?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I always think of change as a progression, right? I don't feel that it's something that is kind of held as an absolute, that it's going to happen in 5 years. And I also want to be very clear that I think we've really laid this out, that there's so many different types of not only institutions, but strategies, right? So I do think it's easier to kind of evaluate, let's say, educational performance versus racial equity, right? Because the time frame of actually looking at, let's say, you want to increase graduation rates in 4 years or something, you can actually hold that as an absolute and kind of make efforts towards that. Whereas I think something like I'm going to change the American belief around immigrant status or sexual orientation. I think those become much more prickly, as opposed, and you can't hold those as absolute, but you can make efforts to that, but I don't think they're always comparable change measures. And I do feel that what happens is that there's this lens of measurements being universal measurements, and I just think that this is just flawed in of itself. One could say, I don't know, world peace, and then a social dynamic will happen that will actually impede upon that from actually occurring. So getting back to your original question about the persons in the garage, I've noticed that people are much more forgiving and gracious in the sense that they give people a time frame. I think there's a certain kind of 5, an infancy space, a kind of a mezzanine, kind of tween year space, and then people kind of get very muscular and they're kind of full-fledged institutions, right? And once they're full-fledged institutions, their impact is much more visible, right? So when you look at something like, I don't know, Teach for America, for instance, right? What it was able to accomplish in year 1 or 2 looks radically different than what it's able to do now at 20 years old. Right, and I think you can actually look at the investors, and I think they would all kind of claim a certain investment at a particular moment of growth for that institution, right? That kind of keeps Vanessa Kirsch, the ED, kind of in people's minds or imaginations, right? So I think even how she would even identify, her own success. Is it growth model of the institution? Is it impact on students? Is it changing the American narrative? Is it all, some, or none of that? I think it's much more open.
Just a kind of a different slice of it. In the same way that we're familiar with leapfrog technology, right? That, you don't need landlines. Why bother to install them in sub-Saharan Africa? Everyone's going to get a cell phone. It's going to be better, So, the old model, and what I would say the East Coast model, you mentioned we hadn't really named it, so I'm going to name it and say that it's institution-based rather than individual-based, right? So the old model was you had to have an institution in place before you could do work, right? And I think the new model is much more flexible and fluid, which is people can come together around a cause or an issue. They work on that cause or issue. Hopefully they solve it or have some progress that's positive progress. And then they can disband and split up and go off and do the next cause or issue that they care about. And just as a small example, that this isn't always comfortable for people, but I think it's more comfortable on the West Coast because I think it follows a little bit more the technology environment there. We have a house up in Columbia County, and there was a lot of community organizing objecting to a cement plant that was going to be put into the local area, and it was going to cause pollution, but it was also going to make jobs, and so there was this whole big brouhaha. So after several years of people in the community getting very active, foundation supported it, all this kind of stuff, they defeated the cement plant coming in. You know, the Swiss corporation that was going to be the parent company for this plant just gave up, right? And they had done some litigation in the state and all this sort of stuff. They gave up. But there was this really hardworking group, the Stop the Plant group, right, that had all of these active citizens, and suddenly they had won, and they didn't know what to do with themselves. And so there was a question like, should they now continue and share their methodology and approach with other communities around the country who were facing similar problems, or should they move on to some other environmental and community problem in their own community that was different than stopping the cement plant? Or, you know, what to do. And it took a while, but they finally concluded that they had done their job and now they could disband. So the people had the personal experience of understanding what it was like to organize, what the effective techniques are. They now had a personal network that was expanded. They had affiliated with folks they might never have talked to or known or cooperated with because they agreed about a particular issue, right? But it was really startling because it took them quite some time to just let go and say, yay, we won. We're not needed anymore. We can all go back to other parts of our lives.
But if they had defined their job differently, their challenge differently, or
Sure.
the social problem differently from the start, if they had imagined that the cement plant, presumably, and I'm guessing, I also have a house in Columbia County, I know this struggle, that the cement plant was one of the great arguments for it was the creation of jobs, as you pointed out. And so if this group had imagined from the start, actually, our challenge is poverty in Columbia County, or the dearth of real meaningful employment in Hudson, a pretty poor city, what might have been a different outcome? Is an interesting question. And so that thinking about the problem from the start and where you see yourself in relation to the problem also gets us to this later question about what is an appropriate end. I want to pick up on something that sort of struck me in this setup again from the East Coast to the West Coast, which is I think that in a lot of the materials that you've read over the course of this semester, and certainly to some extent in the materials that you've read tonight, the notion of performance metrics and the heavy emphasis on them is connected to social entrepreneurship and the influence of sort of the capitalists entering philanthropy. So can you talk a little bit more about the evolution of the interest in performance metrics and how that does connect to these folks who will tolerate the two guys in a garage or the two women in a garage, I hope, and think about sort of whether there is a more nuanced notion of performance metrics going on here, or whether it's really there's a big East Coast misuse of the notion, but where is it, since I think that it's often aligned with those folks?
Sure, well, I'll take a little stab at it. So I think, Meryl, what you're talking about is folks who've been very successful in business, solving problems and being maybe as lucky as they were smart, so benefiting financially in a significant way, and feeling that they not just feeling, but you know, Bill Gates has had a huge impact on the world, right? Love him, hate him, whatever, but what he accomplished with his company has changed the world in a significant way, right? So here were folks who had a huge success doing one set of difficult things where the odds were against them, and now they're in a very privileged position, and so you have to respect and acknowledge they're willing to take some of their resources and try to address other types of problems. And so at some level, and it just seems very natural, it's like I had one set of tools that served me well and made me a success doing one difficult thing. So I'm going to, and those are the tools I know well and I'm comfortable with and they fit my personality, whatever. So now I'd like to improve the social situation, end poverty, you know, do whatever I'm going to do in the world. So these are the tools I know. They were super successful once. I'm going to reapply them now in this new setting. And I don't know that I link that quite specifically to my understanding of social entrepreneurship, but I think that both social entrepreneurship and philanthropic capitalism are growing out of the same phenomenon of the tech boom and the huge wealth that was created at the, you know, over the last 10 or 15 years.